Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking sanctions, in particular, sanctions on Russia around and in the commodities markets. What are those sanctions and what are their cascading impacts in the short and long term, and how can organisations and individuals prepare and plan to navigate this complex world? Our guest is Sarah Hunt, partner at HFW, an international trade and sanctions lawyer. Both Sarah and her firm are specialists in commodity trade finance and sanctions and have been extraordinarily busy over the last 3 years. Sarah's based in Geneva. And also I'll include in the show notes a recent presentation given by Sarah and her team on some of the details we're going to discuss in this episode. As always, please do leave us a positive review on the platform you're listening on or a thumbs up on YouTube. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Delightful to be here.
So we are talking sanctions, in particular Russian sanctions and their impact on the commodities market and commodity participants. Obviously, it's a very complex subject. It's a very detailed subject, so we'll be doing it at a high level. And of course, nothing that we say here should be taken as legal advice, but I'm sure at the end we'll get some guidance from you on how organizations need to start thinking about this. Of course, many already are, and what it means to engage your expertise and so forth. But let's start at the top. Before we talk about sanctions in particular, can we just get a sense of sanctions themselves? What tools are available to governments within those sanctions, and how do they go about enacting them?
So I think the main point here, Paul, is that sanctions are used in a situation where governments want to express strong disapproval to another state, but not go as far as actually sending in ground forces. So sanctions are somewhere between active military conflict and doing nothing at all. And sanctions go back thousands of years. Today we see sanctions enacted by many countries of the world. We've seen a particularly fast-moving package enacted by the G7 in response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, of course, 24 February 22. And those sanctions target all sorts of things. They target dual-use goods with a view to stopping goods being sent through that can be used for production of military goods. They can specifically target individuals and entities by listing or sanctioning those individuals. In the US, that's described as becoming a specially designated national. There are also tools that specifically target types of commodities. So sectoral sanctions, for example, targeting particular products that the G7 does not want to head to or conversely from Russia because of the profit that will mean for the Russian state. And of course, there are sanctions that are a bit more finessed, and they are new debt or sectoral sanction identification list, restrictions on the amount of new debt or credit that can be extended to specific entities, and that's actually being used quite widely also in the packages against Russia.
Yeah, and just some broad sense on kind of the tracking and the enforcement and the consequence.
Absolutely. Look, I think why we are so interested in these sanctions is because if we take, for example, the US, and the US, I think, has really a huge influence over world economy through its secondary sanctions in particular. I think if we just dig down into that as an interesting topic for your listeners, there's no specific requirement for a US nexus to invoke US secondary sanctions. And that means, for example, you don't need to have a parent company or a presence in the US. You don't need any involvement of the US dollar. There is no requirement for a US national. There's no requirement for a physical presence of that trade on US territory or in US airspace. The secondary sanctions will attach regardless. And what does that mean? That means that there is the threat of being listed or sanctioned as a specially designated national. That's sort of the primary threat. And that is a permanent bar, effectively, to doing business in the West, because it is extremely rare to be delisted from that sanction status.
And if you are specially designated, if you are sanctioned in that way, what are the consequences of that? What does that actually mean? Does that mean you're not open as an individual or a company? If a company is, you just don't have access to the entire panoply of Western modern finance and trade infrastructure? Can you give some sense of that?
Precisely. It means, as either an individual or a company, that you are dropped by your banks immediately with no opportunity to continue banking as a business. You will not have, it's not just that you won't have credit lines in that trade finance sense, you won't actually be able to have a bank account where the bank will transfer funds. Why is that? It's because all of these regimes, the UK, the EU, the US, the Canadian regime, the Australian regime, and the Japanese also have a regime which is not so different, have this concept of a sanctioned individual being one where the property, including the funds, must be frozen and not dealt in. So if you do want to make a transfer, you actually need a license to do so. And there are often wind down licenses associated with these sanctioned individuals or companies, which permit certain transactions to be done, or a special specific license can sometimes be applied for. But more commonly, in fact, it's just from one day to the other. That's it. Bang, you're out.
Yeah, and all this ultimately ties back to the fact that most, global trade is predominated by the US dollar. No bank wants to suddenly find itself frozen out of that currency.
So banks, indeed, why do banks that are not in the US, for example, comply with US sanctions? Well, that is because, indeed, the world of international trade is quite a small world, and it is the case that banks are particularly targeted for breaches. We've seen over the years multiple enormous fines levied against Swiss banks, for example, Switzerland being where I live and work. And banks are extremely conservative, and they want to comply in full with US sanctions, regardless of whether they are in the US or even a subsidiary. It's what we would describe as a first-class bank, a bank that is looking closely at these sanctions is going to want to comply with US sanctions in full.
Now we're going to start embarking on the complexity because, of course, US sanctions are done unilaterally sometimes in cohort with other jurisdictions, but you've got an entire web of different sanctions that organizations, banks, and individuals need to navigate. Just on the personal risk side of the equation, how far down through an organization, I know this is a difficult question, does sort of those specially designated persons go? Can organizations find themselves where everyone who involved in that organization suddenly finds themselves individually sanctioned? I mean, what's the career risk for individuals who are concerned about their and what is a lot of grey area or untested areas in terms of case law? There's personal risk here as well, and how far down does that go?
Good question, Paul, because that's actually the very question that I've been asked by a number of individuals over the past couple of years in particular, but certainly prior to that. I think it's the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner, the person who is the owner and the controlling mind of the company, which is generally at the highest risk for actually being listed, particularly where it's a small company. But it's certainly true that as a senior person in a company, we have seen a number of those individuals also being listed. So, for example, if you are taking significant decisions on behalf of the owner and they are in breach of sanctions, you're at risk of being listed as an SDN. Similarly, if you are registered as the official owner on the registry, that many times that sort of official, easily available association with the company as the representative in the commercial register, that has been on quite a few occasions sufficient where the company itself is breaching sanctions to result in that person being listed.
And I'm just staring at what we've got to get through on this. So, I imagine it's going to be a long episode, but a fascinating one. Just before we talk specifics, because I know people are going to be very interested in what sanctions actually there are and what are the latest round and what's the direction of them. There's a couple of elements to get in there. Firstly, of course, they would appear, and this is maybe a biased lens, to disproportionately be focused on commodities. That's because commodities' role in world trade, particularly oil, for example, but also increasingly critical metals and so on. And it's also, they are particularly impactful because of the complex nature of commodities transactions and the number of participants that come together to enable those transactions, from a shipping, from a finance, from a risk, from an insurance, not least the two counterparties themselves. Can you just give us some sense of kind of that complexity of a transaction and how sanctions sort of start eroding and interweaving with all aspects of that, just for an overview before we dive into specifics?
Sure. I think what you rightly are pointing out, Paul, is that complex transactions can give rise to sudden imposition of sanctions, and that has frequently been the case in the many different angles that we have looked at over the past couple of years. And here I'm specifically speaking of the position that traders or owners, shippers, charterers, banks, insurers, P&I clubs, and even aircraft owners find themselves in when they suddenly become in the middle of a transaction which actually becomes legally impossible to perform due to the overnight involvement of sanctioned entities or entities that have sanctioned owners that are more than 50% owned by sanctioned persons, which means the entity itself is subject to sanctions. And we have seen a lot of situations where it has become impossible to fulfill that contractual obligation that that party was in the middle of performing, because by doing so, they would put themselves in breach of sanctions. We regularly, for example, have seen situations where that performing party looks to refuse to perform that contract, and that would be based on an argument that might be specific to a sanctions clause. It might be an argument of impossibility or of illegality or of force majeure. But it's important to remember that you will have to show that the sanctions are actually preventing performance given the particular facts and, importantly, the particular force majeure clause, being mindful of the force majeure distinction between hinder and prevent, which is quite an important distinction, or the relevant common law test in the case of impossibility. So the position taken by different regulators has evolved substantially during the last 2 years. And the key question that traders or parties to a contract need to think about is, when does a contract become legally impossible to perform?
I can imagine that spectrum between hinder and impossible. And of course, the problem therein lies that there is some level of judgment about whether it would or would not fall under sanctions. And you get this whole concept, which I guess we're going to come on to, of self-sanctioning as well, which is, this may be an issue, I don't want to do it, but the other counterparty is saying, well, it might be an issue, but that's not an impossibility.
Absolutely. It is very often the case that a party to a contract that involves a sanctioned party is not able to perform, but sometimes there are situations where there's simply a desire not to perform a contract anymore, for example, because we've seen the classic, of course, is that there was a lot of trade with Russia before the invasion of the Ukraine, February 22. After that invasion, a lot of owners, charterers wanted to get out of long-term contracts of affreightment, wanted to not perform contracts. And I think, there's a difference between a contract being one that one doesn't want to perform or one that one is lawfully able to refuse to perform. And one of the key factors there that we looked at about legal impossibility for sales contract was, well, the starting point is, who's your counterparty and what's that beneficial ownership? There are different definitions in the various sanctions, the UK and the EU and the US specifically, of ownership and control. And we've actually seen some conflicting approaches from the different regulators, even as to the implementation of the EU regulation. That's the classic EU regulation 833 of 2014 and its Swiss equivalent concerning the restrictive measures in view of Russia's actions in the Ukraine.
Have we seen clauses within contracts change recently, sort of anticipating this? I imagine 10 years ago, the risk of being sanctioned or having a trade sanctioned mid transaction was much lower than it is today. Are we seeing within sales contracts, within transactions, people trying to sort of firm up that language and even give themselves an out around that kind of hinder rather than impossible?
Absolutely. Look, we've seen a lot of far stricter clauses in contracts that address sanctions issues. One of the tips I would give to your listeners is that there can, of course, be inconsistencies between the sanctions clause in the contract and the actual sanctions. And sometimes the clause doesn't actually protect the party that wishes not to perform to the extent that that party hoped or expected. What you need to consider when you're thinking about how sanctions apply to your individual organisation or a particular transaction are there specific parties who are subject to the sanctions? Do those individuals, for example, directors or officers, do they have particular nationalities? Do they hold US, EU citizenship? Equally, on the other side, do you want to broaden the concept of the sanctions to not only the performing party, but also protection for the directors and officers? One of the difficulties is that if you have, for example, an entity which is not itself, let's say, a US entity, but you have US ownership, but you haven't anticipated that in your sanctions clause, it may not end up quite being broad enough to cover a situation that would put not only the company, but also the owner or the director in breach of, in that example, US sanctions.
The economic tax that this imposes on smaller companies, in the broad scale of commodities, we've had huge consolidation. And for small companies to navigate all this is extraordinarily impactful, right? But let's move on to the current sanctions. And this could take 2 hours, but maybe you could just give us as best as possible kind of a sweeping overview of the EU, the US, kind of what's going on in oil and LNG, and then we can talk about the most recent ones in metals.
So it's quite easy to give a sweeping overview of oil. In the case of crude oil and products, there are various price caps that apply, and essentially lifting those Russian products and crude to third countries is only permitted where the price cap for the particular product is respected and the supplier is a non-designated entity under the particular sanctions regime. So oil is not so complex. We're also seeing a lot of exodus, of course, from the market in terms of those wishing to lift Russian crude and products. And a lot of that has indeed gone to Dubai, as we discussed at our last very pleasant session in Geneva.
Absolutely.
Now, lifting LNG, the question is, can LNG be lifted from Russia? So first, taking a look at the EU sanctions, the trading of Russian origin LNG is permitted as long as there is no specific prohibition with respect to LNG, and that's falling under specific HS headings. And in practice, what we're seeing is some companies are lifting LNG from Russia, some are not. However, very recently in April of this year, the European Parliament voted to pass rules to allow the European governments to ban Russian LNG. We're awaiting developments there. Now, if we turn to UK sanctions, it is prohibited to acquire or import Russian LNG with the particular CN code 1100 into the UK, or with the intention it will come in. But as long as that is not the intention, prima facie, that trading of LNG does not breach UK sanctions. But of course, it's still going to be the case that any company is going to have to consider to what extent any LNG entity or any entity in the chain is beneficially owned by a sanctioned person. under the UK rules, or to what extent a sanctioned person exerts control over an LNG entity. And of course, there is reputational risk associated with those liftings.
Okay, just to understand that. So you can, you're a UK entity, there are many of them that trade LNG. You can trade Russian cargoes as long as the intention is not that that cargo comes to the UK, provided that you're not interacting with a designated sanctioned individual who's the ultimate beneficiary.
Yeah.
Just a question there. Could you, as a, let's say you sell pens to that entity, is that absolutely that sanctioned entity or whatever, the individual, is that fine? Because it has to in some way be tied to LNG.
No. Look, the concept of a sanctioned entity means that you don't trade with that entity or person. So, subject to wind down periods or licenses, it's a no-go for trading of any sort.
And this is worthwhile pausing here and talking about sanctions, and the difficulty in sort of this, on the policy side, because obviously, and we've had economists on the show talking about this. Obviously, actually, the US, Europe have not really wanted to go after LNG and oil, and therefore you have these sort of strange half measures of price caps and options to, because the spice must flow, and the price at the pump is key for local politicians as well, right? So you've kind of got these half measures and workarounds, which again is kind of doubling down on the complexity and the risk of that sort of grey area of the hinder rather than impossible.
Look, the big issue with this measure, which you describe as a bit of a half measure, because it's not a strict prohibition, but it's rather a price cap, is that as the market moves, the difficulty is it's very hard to neatly contract around trading under the cap. That's because prices are linked to the index, and as the index moves, the price moves. So yeah, that's certainly causing difficulties for traders that are a little unwary or that haven't got sufficiently tight clauses written into their contracts.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
So that's sort of the energy suite. And of course, we're just focusing on Russia here rather than the rest of the world. So you've also got a whole web tied to Iran, tied to Venezuela, tied to other jurisdictions. Metals has been in the news very recently. Can you give us some sense of where we stand there?
Sure. Look, I'm going to start with the EU and the latest EU prohibitions on Russian origin metals, because there has been a sweeping swathe of them. The direct or indirect import or purchase of iron or steel products are prohibited, and that's applicable even where some of those iron and steel products are processed in a third country if incorporating steel products originating in Russia with certain tariff headings. There a 7,200 series, you've got to check the heading. Importers must consequently provide detailed evidence of the country of origin of that iron and steel, where it's used for processing a product in a third country. At the moment, they import into the EU. There are also certain products that can be imported within specific import quotas, and there were some wind-down periods that quite recently expired. In the case of the 7,200 series, there was a wind down of 11 products until 1 April, and there are actually wind down periods that remain in place until October for the 7,200 series. So we've got a little way to go for some of these products still. The other relevant jurisdiction, probably for your listeners, UK and also the US. So we've seen a swathe of legislation from the UK to directly ban imports of Russian metals, and they include aluminium, copper, and nickel. We've seen the US place heavy tariffs on various Russian metal imports. And then in April of this year, the UK and the US announced together that the London Metal Exchange, the LME, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the CME, will no longer trade new aluminium, copper, and nickel produced by Russia. So obviously, as the world's two largest metal exchanges, we see that the LME and the CME set global benchmark prices for the trade of these base metals. And of course, there were some significant flow-on consequences after that announcement.
Yeah. I mean, the cynic in me, because you've got a number of agendas here, right? One is, of course, publicly and rightfully the punishment of Russia, trying to crimp its war machine. And obviously, most of its money comes from commodities exportation. On the other side, we're seeing a proliferation of protectionist measures, around the world in kind of this deglobalizing trend, geo-competition, and a lot of more populist politicians in the democracies, rightfully are not pointing out about how, they dumping, etc., and the loss of manufacturing. Is there, and I guess I'll contextualize this question in kind of a direction of travel, It seems you could, on the one hand, say that these sanctions come in once the EU, for example, feels confident it's replaced Russian gas. Okay, now we'll ban it, right? I don't know if there's any sense of and I guess it's important for commodity traders to be thinking is there a national agenda around putting up protection barriers around any given commodity, and that therefore it could be subject to a sanction going forwards? On the premise that this is punishing Russia?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think, Paul, to be quite honestly, I think this is actually quite a simple answer to your question. I think the thinking and the strategy behind these most recent sanctions, particularly on the metals front, is very clear, and it's been really articulated clearly in those announcements that the regulators have made. What is happening at the moment is all of Russia's resources, all of its primary materials are geared up into generating a huge amount of ammunition. It's becoming a war machine. So we can ask ourselves, why are the G7 looking to decrease metals exactly as we've looked at? Why are there so many regulations? There's a huge raft of complex regulations in all of the G7 which describe prohibitions on dual-use goods. The answer is very simple. The G7 wants to decrease the extent to which Russia can use these products to create weapons and to develop its military industrial base. I saw recently reported last month, actually, in the Financial Times, a report that noted that one of the consequences of the sanctions against Russia is that Russia is unable to manufacture more sophisticated weapons, and it can only manufacture more basic weapons. And that's a sign that these prohibitions on dual-use goods is having an effect. Also, I think if we just simply turn to the announcement that was made on the 1st of May of this year, so just a week ago, OFAC announced on its website the US Department of State is designating over 280 individuals and entities and has identified 16 vessels as blocked property. The designation target Russia's military industrial base, chemical and biological weapons programs, as well as companies and individuals in third countries. And there was a particular focus on China, but other countries targeted included Azerbaijan, Belgium, Russia, Slovakia, Turkey, and the UAE that, says OFAC, help Russia evade and circumvent sanctions to acquire key inputs for weapons or defense-related production intended to further its war in the Ukraine.
Very clear, as you say. And I want to come on to kind of the ramifications of all of this more broadly, because it does start to create that kind of bifurcated world, right, where you're creating a block that is excising itself from US, Western banks, infrastructure, and so forth. And, and all that ultimately is going to lead to higher costs. But let's come on to that. In terms, so you mentioned at the start, when we mentioned these transactions, you've got all these different participants: insurers, the traders themselves, shippers, financiers, and so forth. Rather than, I guess, we probably don't have time to go through them kind of individually, but you obviously you and your firm have been extremely busy these last 3 years, being the leading firm in Switzerland on all these subjects, and that being the epicenter of the commodity trading world, as we discussed in our panel a couple of weeks ago when we were there. Can you give us some sense of which of those participants, those in the transaction, are feeling the most pain or impact,
yeah.
and kind of like what those pinch points are?
Sure. I mean, Paul, you're quite right. We did receive an avalanche of queries from various owners, charterers, traders, banks, insurers, all looking to protect themselves and comply with sanctions, particularly the first 6 months after the invasion. I think certainly one industry really I would have to single out as being very much in the middle of it all are the owners. So, and then the clubs, the P&I clubs, because they are the ones who have to make these incredibly difficult calls about whether or not they provide coverage, whether or not on the owner's part, whether or not they are allowed to refuse voyage orders or they decide to accept the instructions to go and lift, for example, a Russian cargo. And if we just think through perhaps a typical contract scenario where you've got, for example, an FOB, free on board contract, where the risk is going to pass at the load port, let's just say Russian railways, which is of particular interest because it is sanctioned only by the UK, not by the EU or the US, obviously, creates issues for UK clubs and owners. Let's just say Russian railways in this scenario have already been paid when goods are put on the ship, and hence when owner's transaction begins. So, the question really is this direct enough to be captured by the sanctions? And I think it is difficult, and it is a tricky thing for owners, because depending on the wording of the sanctions clause, owners may not be permitted to refuse the charter, as they may only be permitted to do so when owners are at real risk of being sanctioned themselves. It may, if of course instructions are to lift directly from a sanctioned entity, that's much more clear cut, and at that point the P&I club can also chip in and say we're not providing coverage for this lifting. However, a sanctions risk clause for your insurer should be included, typically, that justifies refusal basis no coverage by the club to improve owners' chances of being able to refuse such orders that they do not wish to perform. And I've certainly seen a lot of, a typical stressful situation for owners is where they load a cargo, and let's just say the shipper is also the owner of the cargo, and that entity, that is the owner and the shipper of the cargo, are listed while the cargo is on board the vessel. That obviously creates a lot of tension, and a lot of urgent advice has to be taken in order to deal with that situation in accordance with the applicable regulations that bite vis-a-vis owners.
Yeah, and this is those P&I clubs, those protection and indemnity clubs, those insurers of shipping. I mean, the heat is being turned up on them as well. Recent cases in the US with the Treasury Department going after a particular club that I think was all based out of New York. I mean, I imagine that's because these insurers are involved in hundreds of ships, and I just imagine that's just from a tracing aspect is quite difficult. And then, frankly, we come on to this subject of kind of sanctions arbitrage, which is, I guess that firm that perhaps takes a more lenient view of what it can and can't do is going to economically profit by presumably charging higher prices than its competitors. And that obviously cascades throughout the market, right? You can decide that you are going to deal in Russian oil and keep it to the east of the world and, and make huge margins. I mean, And it's just very complex, and I can imagine every aspect, particularly those insurers. It's a tough gig, but as well as potentially a lucrative one.
I think that's true, and I think what we see in terms of the features, the questions I think that clubs and banks need to ask themselves or will consider when deciding whether or not they can provide coverage, insurance coverage for a trade or finance it are, so firstly they look to the parties, and as you say, it is a complex issue, obtaining full due diligence on a transaction and then assessing whether or not parties are actually sanctioned themselves because of the complexity of the rules on ownership, and whether, for example, owners or shareholders or directors or UBOs are sanctioned, and that all plays into a decision which we need to take as a firm or as a bank, as an insurer, about whether or not a counterparty advising obviously a client in our case is sanctioned or deciding whether or not to go ahead with the transaction. Then similarly, you have a lot of complexity around the product itself. So a product can be sanctioned as a result of its origin, its destination, its load port, the transit route, and one component of a product being sanctioned might result in the whole product consequently being sanctioned. And here, for example, we just spoke about steel products containing metals imported from Russia. So people are being caught out at every stage. If they're being transported by a sanctioned entity, the product can become contaminated by sanctions, and that can apply to sea or rail or air travel. And I think what I would advise those parties is to have a really tightly drafted clause, sanctions clause in their operative terms. And of course, everyone, all of these organisations these days have highly specialised risk and sanctions teams. There's an increasing tendency to have a sanctions officer who just, or more than one, and that person needs to spend, it's a full-time job monitoring these sanctions.
Yeah, and I want to finish up on that talent aspect, because we're seeing obviously that from our line of work in terms of executive search. One of the challenges here is, of course, how new these sanctions are, and the fact, therefore, I assume, and you can tell me, there is limited case law, alongside the fact, of course, you've got multiple jurisdictions having somewhat similar but some different sanctions targeting the same stuff. Where do we, it's extremely expensive to go and litigate. That obviously then triggers self-sanctioning. It's just not worth the risk, even if we can do it. But where do we sit on the case law side? I mean, how are these things playing out in court, and how much is that creating a backbone of common law to support future decision making?
So, a good question, Paul. In terms of the case law and where this is taking us on sanctions, we're certainly seeing a body of case law coming from particularly London, also some case law coming through other jurisdictions, including notably Singapore. I just want to highlight one case which caught the public eye and certainly caught the attention of the legal profession, which was, of course, the Boris Mintz and PJSC National Bank Trust matter. And that was a judgment on the 6th of October 2023. It was a UK Court of Appeal judgment, and it caused considerable concern over potential broadening of the meaning of control by a sanctioned person, Mr. Putin. And in essence, what that judgment suggested was that every Russian entity could be controlled by Putin and therefore potentially subject to the UK asset freeze. Now, we, of course, were involved in advising clients in relation to this judgment, as I think all sanctions firms were around the globe. But I think helpfully, the UK authorities, and that was obviously quickly issued guidance stating the judgment did not reflect the reality of UK sanctions. And they stated, this is a quote from their statement, which was issued following that judgment, Mintz, there is no presumption on the part of the government that a private entity based in or incorporated in Russia or any jurisdiction in which a public official is designated is in itself sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the relevant official exercises control over that entity. Now, what they were really saying was, look, the UK sanctions regime exists and should be interpreted in accordance with the plain English meaning of the regulations, and we did not intend, and we refute any suggestion that effectively every Russian entity could be controlled by Putin. So they were really saying to the community, please don't take the wording from the Minsk judgment out of context, comply with the regulations that we publish.
Zooming back out, there's some big things here, right? Firstly, there is this proliferation of sanctions becoming a go-to tool of governments in a tit-for-tat reactionary sort of world policy. And there is also, and obviously sanctions themselves are double-edged swords, because essentially, we've seen this throughout history. In fact, I was reading a history book the other day where the Hittites, you mentioned they started thousands of years ago, the Hittites in Anatolia sanctioned the Greeks from importing into the city of Ugarit. So these have been going on for a while. But what happens is trade routes just reorientate, domestic industries start up. There is a whack-a-mole sense to this, and it ultimately debilitates the sanctioner as well as the sanctionee, particularly as we see this play out in the US dollar. And we did an episode on the long-promised de-dollarization, which is a different discussion. But I guess, what is the direction of travel here? And in fact, do we see sanctions unwind, or kind of once they're there, and we're just creating new regimes every 3 years for the commodity traders to try and survive in, and ultimately all that does is rise costs for everyone?
Okay, look, it's a good question. I think the short answer is that commodity traders, I would not personally say that the large commodity traders are not at risk in terms of their profitability. I think we all read that at the FT conference. They have had hugely successful P&Ls for the last couple of years, because, as we know, where there is movement, there is profit to be made. In terms of your query on the evolving long-term impact of markets, we see here that Russian crude and product, Russian crude is being transported lawfully. If it's transported below the cap, at or below the cap, it's being transported out to India and to the UAE, and it's being brought back to the EU lawfully as refined product, provided that the complex web of sanctions around that exercise are complied with. So I think that's sort of the direction of travel of that particular product. Equally, if we look at the participants in that market, because that's one of the markets that's easiest to analyze, you have a dramatically reduced number of participants. A lot of international companies are simply refusing to do business with Russia at all. You have self-sanctioning in the case of banks who literally refuse to finance trades involving Russia at all, even lawful ones. And you do have, of course, this sort of counter movement where you're seeing some traders move out of the US dollar and into other currencies, or into currencies such as Minbi or the UAE currency, or even into cryptocurrency. But and I really want to make this point, that is not necessarily meaning that everything's just reorganizing itself. It's a little more complex than that. A lot of traders that have sort of attempted to circumvent or gone too close through the grey zone into the zone they really shouldn't be in have actually been sanctioned. And so there is a real decrease in the number of traders that are prepared to do business with Russia. And I think we spoke about secondary sanctions, and what we're seeing with the dramatic upscaling, and it really is quite unprecedented, the worldwide targeting of non-G7 and within the G7 nationalities and companies. You're getting a lot of companies that are no longer able to trade after going too close to the edge and trading with Russia. And we just need to try and remember that. Sure, everyone speaks of the sanctions not perhaps working as well or as quickly as one might hope, but in fact, a lot of companies are taking advice. A lot of companies are complying with advice. Chinese companies are taking advice and complying with it because they don't want to be sanctioned. And many, many companies are getting their fingers burnt or simply being put out of business by being sanctioned. So I think, it's not so easy these days to circumvent, to get around, to escape sanctions is the short answer, because the long arm of OFAC, the US regulator, and increasingly also the UK regulator, taking shots at and knocking off traders that choose to breach the sanctions, regardless of where they do that.
Yeah. There's even some sense as well that the economic might of the West has given China some pause over Taiwan, for example, in recognition that militarily you could take it over, and we've covered on this podcast about the fact that there wouldn't be any chips factories left. But there is a real sense of actually how powerful, how much stroke this has, and ultimately, the West is China's market.
Yeah.
But anyway, that aside, just I could go on. I find it fascinating. What, just in kind of the public service aspect of this podcast, those global traders that we've been discussing in part have always been set up to be swift moving and figure out, where and how they can do business in more challenging jurisdictions. So sort of leaving them aside for a moment, but just talking more broadly about your US refiner, your UK, oil retail business, and of scale, obviously, how do you go about setting up your organization? What have you seen to make sure that you aren't just bogged down in paralysis, or indeed, much worse, unwittingly getting yourself in a situation which is existential to your business? I mean, how you mentioned these sanctions officers. Are they, how do they engage with you? How do you get ahead of this? What are you seeing best practice from a personnel standpoint?
Great. So I think, Paul, the answer is training, screening, a good in-house legal team, taking advice quickly, having a team that is ready to act. And obviously, we all these days, if we're in international trade, if we're touching on it, it's not just Russia, there's Venezuela and many other jurisdictions where you need to have effectively a sanctions officer and a hotline and a team of compliance-oriented expertise, which may include legal officers, sanctions officers. It will almost certainly have to include some people who are very familiar with these checks. And of course, there are so many organizations that are providing us with updates on things like vessel movements, red flags around those movements, detailed information about corporate structure. And there have been huge movements in terms of the rapidity of these sanctions because of this avalanche. We had 12, 13 rounds from the EU. Companies had to move much more quickly, I think, than they usually would. They had to quickly exit from Russia effectively, and almost all commodities after being completely interwoven. And we saw a real need for very sharp-minded individuals who were able to make, frankly, some quite complex calls. And here, we can speak, for example, about the intersection of sanctions with different regimes: shipping, trading, trade finance, insurance, aviation. And, we certainly were at the epicenter of all that. It's with some pride that I should credit my colleague in London, Daniel Martin, and his colleague Anthony Woolwich, our colleagues Pauline Aurora and Michael Maxwell, Pauline in Paris, Michael in Australia. We've also got Gary English and Chris Hart, our US sanctions specialists. So that kind of worldwide team and all the associates that worked so hard to deliver fast advice to clients that were really in a huge amount of need of urgent advice is part of your package in terms of talent. And I agree, there's a real need for talent in this space right now.
Yeah. Well, and I should say, you and your firm are spoken very highly of by the commodity trading community. From our side, we have seen an absolute rise in demand for general counsels, so chief legal officers, as well as compliance teams, and you can just see that in our placement history over the last 3 years. Also, actually, Enco Insights, which is our sister firm that's an expert network, one of the really fast growth areas there is expert witnesses, right? In all these proliferation of court cases, just helping jurors, judges understand the nature of trading and contracts and so forth and performance. So go to Enco Insights if you have interest or a need there. Just out of interest, have we seen, it would seem to me that there's a ripe opportunity, and this might be my ignorance, there might be loads of them, of kind of organizations that will do that screening for you. You can just go to a company that has that database, that has all of those, traced all those different organizations, and quickly be able, because speed is of the essence here, right? This is trading decision. There's an absolute competitive advantage in being quick. Are there services out there where you can just go and say, run the traps on this company, this product, this individual?
Absolutely. There are a lot of companies that have been doing this work very well for a number of years, and I think they are becoming increasingly important in terms of monitoring these sanctions. The particular issue which I've seen on the rise in the past 2 years are these red flags, and the red flags are these specific warnings about individuals, organizations, or vessels, and they may include a history of involvement with, as a PEP, a politically exposed person, or potentially a suspicious pattern of behavior as a vessel, for example, suspicious, inexplicable STS operations, transponders.
Which we know 10% of the current fleet is currently running around with transponders off, right? I mean, anyway, well, Sarah, it's been an absolute joy having you on. I will, of course, put links to HFW in the show notes. And, I encourage people, if they have questions, to reach out to you, definitely not me. And hopefully we can have you back on in a year or so. And, this is such a consequential story. It's such a fast-moving story to catch up on the direction of travel and where we stand.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been great fun speaking with you, and a delight to chat through all of these issues with you. Very best regards to all of our clients who are also your listeners, and good luck. Stay safe.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.